have to say that this is a very special event for us here at SITE and the Stockholm School of Economics. Simon is one of the leading experts, of course, on a lot of things and got the Nobel Prize for certain of these things. But what some of you may or may not know is that Simon has worked extensively on issues related to Ukraine and on sanctions against Russia. And I'm very fortunate that we could make this event here today in his very busy schedule during the Nobel Week. For those that don't know Simon, he's the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Management at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. He was also the chief economist at the IMF for some time. And I don't actually have a copy of your book around, but I think maybe we can have something to show to you.
Yeah.
Because if you're not done with your Christmas shopping, and since you're actually here and interested in these topics, this is Simon's latest book, together with Daron, who also won the Nobel Prize this year. It's called Power and Progress. So I think maybe we cleaned out, or someone cleaned out the Akademibokhandel from all of the copies around here, but I'm sure it can be ordered online. So that's the Christmas suggestion for this year. I'm not going to take very much time. I just want to say how important we actually here also at SITE think the issue of sanctions against Russia is. It is about limiting the resources Russia has available to wage this horrible war in Ukraine. But as we can also see, limiting the resources of a country like Russia has implications in a lot of different countries in the world. We just saw what happened in Syria. I think we can probably bet on Transnistria getting closer to Moldova or being integrated even into the regular society of Moldova, as a consequence of Russia not having enough resources to spread around the world at some stage. But of course, I'm not going to take more of your time now. I think we should just give Simon a very warm hand of welcome. And then a practical note, I have my excellent colleague Maria Perrotta. She's the sanction coordinator at SITE. She's organizing a network working on sanctions. She will be your moderator later on and also tell you a bit about the work we do here on sanctions. But Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's really a fantastic opportunity. And first and foremost, I think I should say thank you, Torbjörn, to you and your colleagues at SITE for great leadership on these issues. And thank you to Sweden and to Swedish government and to the Swedish civil society for being so engaged with everything related to Ukraine. I mean, I must say that I'm telling everybody around the world that when historians look back on this era, this episode of human history and geopolitics, I think what will stand out as a symbol of the moment is the fact that Sweden and Finland decided to no longer be neutral pretty much the day after, or the same day that Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. So the fact you were on the sidelines deliberately for a long time, I respect. You know, it's a difficult world and has been a difficult neighborhood. And the fact that you decided that this is the time that you, for yourselves, need to join NATO, I fully understand. And appreciate, but I think you also did it because you want to express and feel and have demonstrated solidarity with Ukraine, and I think that's fantastic. And I wish more countries around the world had your perspective on events. So I will address you, and I'm sure there's a range of opinions across Swedish society. I understand the value of consensus in all settings, including in Sweden, and I want to address you as friends, and I'm sure skeptical friends. And I think my job is to propose ideas and to try and push all my friends, including those in the US Treasury and those who may appear in the Trump administration and those in different governments well, those in Brussels and in different governments, to push everyone in a direction that's going to be helpful. And I think that, quite honestly, time is limited, both this afternoon, we have until 3 o'clock, but I think in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, the clock is not, my read is the clock is not in our favor. So I will be entirely blunt with you, and I hope that in the Q&A we can explore nuances, and you'll let me express perhaps a few caveats. But I think the fact of the matter is really quite simple and straightforward, and even rather dramatic. And I would put it this way, that if the goal is to stop Vladimir Putin's aggression, to induce him to withdraw from Ukraine, and I think you appreciate this more than anybody else probably around the world, well, apart from Finland perhaps and a few others, that Mr. Putin is not the worst possible scenario for Russia. There is going to be a Russia for a long time. That Russia will have a lot of nuclear atomic material, perhaps a lot of nuclear weapons even. And we need to find ourselves in a world where whoever controls Russia and whatever their ideology and beliefs, they do not go around attacking other people in their neighborhood, or you who are close to their neighborhood but not exactly in their neighborhood. And quite honestly, and I'm speaking with deep respect for everybody who's worked on sanctions and all the diplomats and all the economists and everybody, the form of sanctions that says we will not sell things to Russia that they need, we'll put on export controls, it's not meaningless. There are certain things that you should make sure it's harder for them to get. And so I'm not saying we should repeal those at all, but I'm saying that those are absolutely, and perhaps we could even call them necessary, perhaps it's okay, but they're certainly not sufficient. I mean, anything the Russians want to buy from the West, perhaps not from Sweden, but I'm sure we can name other prominent European countries that begin with the letter G or the letter I or the letter F. They buy them through Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or Armenia or somewhere else. I'm going to claim that that's common knowledge in this room and move on. I think that in addition, the freeze on Russian foreign exchange assets held in the West, which was, I will readily concede, a brilliant opening move in the chess game, and unexpected, and it had some shock value for about 20 minutes. That is definitely necessary, but also absolutely, definitely not sufficient, because what was granted to Russia, as I'm sure you're all aware, what was an important exemption or exception, which is that they're allowed to sell oil on the world market to receive those dollars. Okay, so they can't go through the national bank, has to go through Gazprom Bank. I mean, come on, this is Russia we're talking about. I mean, this doesn't even detain them for a few minutes to think about alternative arrangements of that kind. So cutting them off from there, it is interesting and an important point to consider that a country with a large current account surplus built on trading relationships with Western countries largely turns around and attacks, I would say, those Western countries in the international order, which has generated those surpluses. And I regard, and I fully support and have long recommended that those assets be taken. You could take them into escrow. You could show the Russians what will happen, or the payment schedule that they will not receive if they don't pull out. Or my suggestion yesterday to the, we had a discussion with some officials and private sector on rebuilding Ukraine. My suggestion is that if you want to put money into Ukraine and rebuilding assets that are important and visible, and therefore targets for Russian missile and drone attacks, you paint a big letter in big letters on them. This was paid for with Russian assets. And if you destroy it, that's your money you've just blown up. That's what I would do. I mean, I worked a lot in Russia and Ukraine and other parts of the world, of that world, in the 1990s. And I have great respect and affection for Russian people at the individual level. And I've studied Russian culture. My Russian language skills are rusty, but they used to be quite good. And that, all they understand is power. It's blunt, straightforward. What can you do to me? What can I do to you? That's it. Nothing else matters. So we come to the situation where export restrictions, don't work, of not stopping the war. The freezing of their foreign exchange assets and the taking of the interest from those assets, that's also, it's fine, but it's not consequential in terms of the war. there was a proposal, there is a policy in place to cap the price of oil that Russia receives. And what was really clever about this point is, as I'm guessing you all know, the marginal cost of production in Western Siberia is, let's say, no more than $20 a barrel. In fact, during COVID, they were willing to sell their oil at below $20 a barrel. And the proposal, as it was initially formulated, was that Russia would receive a price that was only low relative to marginal cost of production. You know, they're so desperate for cash that they would pump and supply this oil to the world if they're making $1 or $2 a barrel, in my view. And instead, they're allowed to make a lot more than that. But that, you know, the fact of the matter is, and I recognize this is embarrassing, and I recognize this is awkward, and this is difficult for a lot of my friends. But the fact of the matter is that the implementation of the oil price cap was absolutely and utterly pathetic. This is a failure of the G7, a failure of the European Union. It's a failure of the Biden administration. The Biden administration contains many good friends of mine. I worked with them closely on advancing this idea and advocating for it. And I think the people who put it forward, Janet Yellen and her team, are not responsible for the pathetic implementation. I think that was largely the White House. I think they failed to follow through, failed to understand the economics, frankly. The economics are that Russia will continue to produce 8 million barrels of oil a day in a world that consumes 100 million barrels. They will continue to produce that as long as they're making a little bit of money. They have no onshore storage. There's plenty of places around the world that want to buy this oil at a discount. The point of the oil price cap was to drive that price down and create a better deal for India and China. And it hasn't happened for one simple and straightforward reason, is we allowed an increasing amount of this oil to be transported through the so-called shadow fleet. And if you read The Economist editorials on this, and some very good friends of mine run The Economist too, there's a lot of hand-wringing. Oh my goodness, there's a shadow fleet, and you couldn't possibly enforce the rules and enforce a price cap because the shadow fleet will exist. I mean, give me a break, people. Okay, you are an integral part of the most powerful military and economic alliance in the history of humankind. And there are 900 ships that transport oil illegally, breaking sanctions against Venezuela and Iran around the world. It's the same ships that are moving the Russian oil. The same ships violating sanctions against Iran and Venezuela, and therefore opening themselves up to additional sanctions. But in addition, you know the logic of sanctions and how the Americans work. Anybody who transacts with those ships, anyone who buys oil that's passed through the sanctioned ships, must, by logic and law, themselves face sanctions. And I am told on very good authority that while China is, generally speaking, okay with oil, so a lot of times oil will be lifted out of the Baltic, for example, out of the Black Sea. It'll be lifted in Suezmax ships, carrying maybe 900,000 barrels. It'll go to a ship-to-ship transfer. They put it on a very large crude carrier. The very large crude carrier will drag it all the way around to China, for example. This is all public knowledge. This is tracked in real time by some of the best experts in the world, some who live in Sweden, by the way, some who work for Bloomberg. We can see every single ship. There is nothing secret or hidden about any transaction on the high seas, and most of Russian oil moves, as you know, across the sea. So, and there is a blacklist, by the way. There is a blacklist of ships involved in sanctions trade with Iran. That list of that ship is about 300 ships maintained, the American database. That's not the right, that is not the complete list of ships. It's 900 ships. So what we need, and what I'm asking for from Sweden, and I did have a chance to you're very kind to Nobel laureates, I have to say, amazingly kind. It's really, really generous. So what I said to the foreign secretary, your foreign minister last night at dinner, what I said to the prime minister, what I said to other ministers, what I'm saying out loud, and this meeting is entirely public as far as I'm concerned, and you could feel free to tweet whatever you want from this, is that thank you to Sweden for your leadership, and I think that you should publicly and privately embrace the policy of telling the Americans and Mr. Trump, who turns out to be quite concerned about China. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I have no confidential information, of course, but I read in the newspaper that the Iranians tried to kill him. Ships that are lifting Iranian oil and moving it to China, surely that's not something he's going to be comfortable with. And I think the American administration should become really focused on enforcing their own sanctions. And if you take the Black Fleet out of the Russian oil business, and it all becomes a so-called compliant fleet, then we have a completely different ballgame. Then you've changed the dynamics of power. And as I said, well, as you know, the Russians play chess. They like chess. They like to think ahead in the chess game. So the first move the West made one good move. Okay, maybe 1.5 good moves in a chess game 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I mean, come on, that's not enough. The next move is to identify, to publicize, to report the names of the Stark fleet. Every single one of these ships is known. Every single one of you can follow the movement of these ships. You can follow the ship-to-ship transfers. You can watch it on satellite. You can have it on the front page of your newspapers. Sweden can be, sorry, the Nordic Alliance, whatever you're calling yourselves, this group of countries that really gets this, can consistently and politely, I know that's how you like to work, and in a consensus-building manner, I also know how you like to work, can raise these points with the relevant authorities, including in the United States. And I'm wearing this badge. Okay, I'm wearing this one because I won a Nobel Prize. I'm wearing this one because I was at a fantastic event organized by your ambassador in Washington for laureates a few weeks ago. And the ambassador, in his welcoming speech to the dinner, to which he invited people from all across American political society, starts off by talking about Ukraine and NATO. And then he reminds the Americans that Swedish companies employ 300,000 people in America. You should also tell them that every week, please. keep them on the right side of that issue as well. But I think there's a role here I really think there's a role for Sweden, for SITE, for our coalition of economists, but more broadly within political circles, it should be incredibly embarrassing, really awkward that these ships that are, I'm not asking for new sanctions. I'm asking for the enforcement of sanctions already in place against Venezuela and Iran. The ships that are engaged in that sanctioned trade are moving Russian oil. This is a matter of public information and data, and we can provide sources for anybody who wants to know this. If a sanctioned ship touches Russian oil, transports it to India, moves it through ship-to-ship transfer onto a larger ship that moves it to India or China, that should trigger sanctions against the receiving party. And so the story from China is, well, the Chinese don't care on average about this and are happy to let it slide into the country. When they get a call from the American embassy saying, don't let this ship in, this ship is a sanctioned ship, and anybody in China who engages in this business will themselves be sanctioned, they turn the ship around and send it back to where it came from. So that's my proposal to you today. That's my suggestion to Sweden. That's my offer for you to once again lead the world. And if you don't want to do it, we'll find somebody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Johnson, for being with us today, for your important work on this topic, and for your straightforward communication on this topic that is super important.
That was the polite version. Do you want me to give them the blunt version?
You can be as blunt as you please here. Well, I'm going to open the discussion very soon. I'm sure our audience is very eager, but please take a seat.
If I take a seat, I'll fall asleep. I'm sorry to say. We've had a wonderful seminar downstairs, discussion with the Stockholm School of Economics, at the end of which the students came out and sang the St. Lucia, Santa Lucia, and it was. It's been a long week, so I'm going to stand. I'm going to stay standing.
All right, I'm just going to take a few minutes just to reiterate what you touched upon: the importance of research, of fact-based analysis, and of outward, straightforward communication, because this is very fundamental for sanction effectiveness. So sanctions are potentially a very powerful policy tool, but their efficiency hinges on careful design. You talked about the price cap, on careful research-based evaluation on their impact, and also on unbiased outward communication. so that sanctions are understood and supported, because participation is essential. So it's the participation of countries in the sanction coalition, and within those countries, participation of voters, because we're talking about democratic countries, and participation of firms. So corporate compliance is very important. But this support is hinging on the perception that the sanctions are working. If people believe that sanctions are not having any impact, that if they hear stories that life in Russia is going on as usual and they don't feel anything, it's just us facing the high energy prices, for example, well, this support may waver. And let's be honest, these narratives are not accidental. They're explicitly crafted to undermine the effectiveness of sanctions. So if people doubt the effectiveness of sanctions, firms will find ways to circumvent them. Governments might hesitate in bearing the economic and political costs, and therefore participation will then weaken the effectiveness. And in this way, information and narratives are actually shaping the state of the world. So that's why we believe that it is very important to counter these narratives. And we at SITE are trying to do our little contribution to this work, partly with events such as this. We're extremely happy to have you here talking about this. This is part of our mission. We are, for example, recently we released a report about the Russian economy. And we also make the point that why it is so difficult to actually understand what's the state of the Russian economy. Well, because controlling the narrative is part of the Russian strategy to win this war. Yeah. And it's not, and similarly with sanction, it's very similar. If they can spread the idea that sanctions are not effective, then calls to lift them will become louder. And it's not a coincidence that the voices that oppose support to Ukraine are the same voices that claim that sanctions don't work. So this is why research-based and fact-based analysis is so vital. I will say one last thing. We are also, as part of this effort, working on the launch of a sanctions portal supported by the Minister for Foreign Affairs, where we want to collect all the studies and evidence about the effect of sanctions against Russia to make it available and accessible for general public, for policymakers, for journalists, so that these narratives have a counterbalancing voice also. And as part of this, we also working on index together with our colleagues in Norway from co-risk and state capture, an index that will measure countries' compliance with sanctions. Also with the same idea that providing a clear picture of how sanctions are implemented and where they are weaker, it can be strengthened. Yeah, so stay tuned for more from us on this topic. And now, before I open then the floor, I want to introduce another guest, because we believe that in all questions that have to do with Ukraine, it's very important to understand the perspective from Ukraine as well. And to bring us this perspective from Ukraine, I'm pleased to introduce to you Yuliia Pavytska, who is the manager of the sanctions program at the Kyiv School of Economics Institute. Yuliia has been, since the full-scale invasion, led efforts to assess the effectiveness of sanctions, assess the state of the Russian economy, and develop new proposals for sanctions. And she works closely with coalition authorities and research institutions to strengthen the quality and the effectiveness of these measures. Yuliia will share with us insights on the consensus from Ukrainian experts on what are the current priorities in terms of sanctions. However, she's not with us live, or she might be with us live, but she sent a pre-recorded video message to avoid connection issues.
Dear Professor Johnson, dear colleagues from SITE, ladies and gentlemen, Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude for the honor of being invited to contribute to today's discussion and address critical issues related to the current state of Russian economy and the sanctions regime imposed against it. Russia's brutal war of attrition against Ukraine is approaching its third anniversary, and we must conclude that the Kremlin continues to have sufficient resources to pursue its war against Ukraine. With this in mind, I would like to highlight 3 important points today. First, sanctions can work and significantly affect the regime's ability to manage the Russian economy. However, we are losing the battle against circumvention. The presence or absence of $300 billion in reserves makes a significant difference, as does the availability of an additional $200 billion in trade surpluses. However, it is clear that sanctions have not yet constrained Russian economy enough to force a change in its behavior. In contrast, Russia is currently outmaneuvering the sanctions coalition in circumvention efforts. Energy sanctions, which are among the most crucial measures to disrupt aggressors' revenues, no longer effectively do so. In addition to the well-known enforcement issues surrounding the price cap, the buildup of the Russian shadow fleet has completed the fundamental erosion of the price cap regime. By October this year, the discount on Russian oil export prices, a good proxy of the effectiveness of the price cap enforcement, had reached its lowest level since the start of the full-scale invasion. At the same time, old, insufficiently maintained and likely underinsured tankers belonging to the Russian shadow fleet, which operates outside of the price cap regime, accounted for 85% of all seaborne crude oil exports in October. This has allowed Russia to generate significant additional export earnings, close to $9 billion from crude oil alone in the first 10 months of this year. Unfortunately, energy sanctions are not the only area where we face substantial challenges. Another key issue is the export controls regime, which is designed to limit Russia's access to dual-use and military goods critical for its war efforts. While the Kremlin appears to pay sharp and high markups for the imports, the volume of microchips, CNC machines, and other high-tech equipment still reaching Russia via friendly countries indicates that the system is not working as intended. Last year, Russia imported high-priority goods worth $12.5 billion. 40% of the total came from the companies headquartered in countries that have imposed export controls in Russia. Out of more than 4,200 foreign components found in Russian weapons by Ukrainian authorities since the start of the full-scale invasion, 95% are coming from the companies headquartered in coalition countries, with 73 coming from US-based companies alone. Unfortunately, these dynamics are reflected both on the battlefield and in the skies over Ukrainian city, and unfortunately they illustrate critical weakness of the current sanctions regime. My second point, though, is more optimistic and promising. The Russian economy is becoming more difficult to manage due to the structural imbalances created by the war. It has become increasingly evident that the overheated Russian economy has effectively exhausted its spare capacity, while war-related expenditures are emerging as the biggest disruptor. Record war-related fiscal stimulus, combined with the very tight labor market leading to the near double-digit real wage growth, significant expansion of credit to the private sector, and a very weak ruble, which by the way has now risen above 100 per US dollar again, are creating significant inflationary pressure. Despite the central bank's recent efforts to bring the situation under control, the hike in the core rate to 25% has not yet to any meaningful reduction in inflation. Further tightening of monetary policy is unavoidable. However, it is unlikely to resolve the situation, rather further squeeze the activity in non-military parts of the economy and lead to an overall slowdown. And last but not least, we must leverage the momentum of Russia's imbalanced economy and significantly increase pressure via sanctions. We need to make sanctions great again. Discussions about the peace negotiations with Russia are taking place in the public domain. Ukraine is the one that seeks the end of the war as soon as possible with a fair resolution in mind. However, as on the battlefield, the only way to engage with Russia and force them to withdrawal from Ukraine is to speak from the position of power. Therefore, we need bold steps from the sanctioned coalition countries in the upcoming months to put Russia in its weakest economic position ever. In this regard, we propose 3 main steps. Step 1. Rein in Russia's energy revenues. Hopefully, in the nearest future, we will finally see the energy sanction packages from the US and EU able to turn the table for Russian energy trade. The shadow fleet, allowing both Russia to earn extra revenues as well as to forcefully play with the world in a sort of ecological Russian roulette, should be sanctioned out of existence, while the EU finally needs to take a decision and get rid of Russian LNG and move to a full energy ban with Russia. Step number 2, major disruption of supply chains. This means that sanctioned coalitions should adopt a comprehensive sanction package targeting third country intermediaries facilitating Russia's import of dual-use and critical components to disrupt supply chain, as well as take enforcement action against third country financial institutions facilitating Russian imports of military-related goods. And step number 3, immobilize financial system. The latest US package targeting 50 Russian banks, including Gazprombank, has had a strong impact. Securing transactions for international trade is currently the Achilles heel of Russian financial system. Therefore, systematic sanctioning of banks and financial institutions must continue. I would like to conclude by emphasizing the sense of urgency. If the current strategy towards Russia fails, the long-term cost will be severe. If Putin's geopolitical ambitions in Ukraine are not stopped, they will only grow, while the authoritarian leaders worldwide will receive a strong signal that pushing boundaries of rules-based international order is tolerated and accepted. Sanctions alone will not end this war. However, leaving Russia with insufficiently constrained access to financial resources and critical components will undermine the military and financial support provided to Ukraine thus far. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address these critical issues today.
You want to react to this, Professor Johnson?
I agree. Let's have questions and push back. That's how we build consensus in Sweden, right?
All right.
You call.
Please.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Because why don't you tell me who you are or your perspective or whatever you want to say, just so give me context. I'm a visitor.
Secure energy transition in the Baltic Sea region, with particular interest also in Ukraine. And also, I'm very focused on the strategy we're talking about or vulnerability in the beginning. You mentioned a lot of sensible advice and economic reasoning why we should do things maybe differently. And what I wonder is, because I think that the European Union and maybe the US and other Western countries as well have been looking back and, you know, we've been surprised in a way, disappointed that their strategies did not work the way that they intended. And then I wonder, is there, on the one hand, good sense in what you're saying? And on the other hand, there are the democratic governments. I mean, in other words, should we also start not following the rules? Should we also start being more creative in how we respond because we're just too nice, too good, and that is not effective in the world that we live in?
Well, look, there's a very deep philosophical aspect to that. But I'm just an economist, and I'm the former chief economist of the IMF. And it occurs to me, and I'm attempting to bring to your attention, that there are already sanctions in place for Iran and for Venezuela. And these sanctions are enforced, but not consistently. And I'm calling for the complete enforcement of what's already been agreed by the relevant countries, because I think the one piece missing from what Yuliia said, but only because I didn't get my memo to her in time, is that the shadow fleet that's carrying Russian oil is almost entirely comprised of ships that have already been sanctioned. Now, additional sanctions on, fine, but that's what we got stuck on previously, and you couldn't move the Biden administration. I think what we all should be saying to the incoming Trump administration is, congratulations, you have this tool to use against Iran, and bargaining will continue relative to Venezuela. It's a slightly different situation that we can discuss if you want. But Iran is not a friendly country, and these ships, if you handle Iranian oil, you are subject to sanctions. That's how it works. And if you deal with any of those ships, and if any of those ships deal with Russian oil, everybody in that chain of transactions should also be subject to sanctions. So I mean, I didn't make the rules, guys. I didn't make the rules. Those are the rules. Those are the rules that have been agreed already across Western countries. Those are the rules that are entirely. I spoke to the Prime Minister last night, and he was very, you know, as you can imagine, well informed, and obviously has a very sympathetic attitude towards Ukraine. But he said, you know, the international law of the sea is what it is, and ships are allowed to pass through the straits, the Danish straits, and so on. And that's absolutely correct. I'm not asking for any new legal initiative whatsoever. I'm just saying, enforce the sanctions that you already put in place. Follow the logic. I mean, the rules are the rules. That's the missing piece here. Should we take a vote? No.
More questions. I'm thinking maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions. So
good technique for managing the IMF executive board. Absolutely. Let's do it here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Eric Widman. I work for the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but not specifically on this topic.
We can have you reassigned.
Well, you'll know after the question. So you said that the sanctions that have been put in place were necessary but not sufficient. Are you claiming that if you do what you're proposing now with the shadow fleet, would that be sufficient? An add-on on that, I'm curious whether. Okay, so will sanctions actually produce the results that we want, which is ending the war and have Russia pull back? You could argue that the limits to the resources that Russia has at its disposal is just a question of how much pain can they inflict on their own people in extracting resources. And that I would argue that that's quite a significant amount of pain, a lot more than we could stand or accepting right now.
Sure, absolutely. But very good questions, and I think deeply rooted in an understanding of Russia. And I would say the following: most of the electronics that go into Russian drones and missiles come from China. They do buy some stuff from Western Europe, and that's pretty embarrassing too. But you know, the Chinese are not giving the Russians credit. They're not willing to take, Vladimir Putin's credit. It's cash on delivery, right? So you need cash. And where can the Russians get cash? And you need hard cash. And actually, you need dollars, quite honestly. Most of the dark money around the world, most of the dark transactions between people who don't like you and I think you should not like them, is settled ultimately in dollars. The Russians have 2 sources of dollars. They have the stock of dollars they've already accumulated. It's like most oil exporters, most of the time in the world economy, that runs a current account surplus. Well, you froze those assets and they can't use those assets. So that was clever. They can't use the stock. But because of concerns about the flow of oil to the world market and implications for the world oil price, it was decided among Western nations initially to grant them this big exemption so they can take the cash that they take from current oil sales and use that to do whatever they want. Well, supposedly there's restrictions, but we know what they do with it. They buy weapons or components into weapons from China. Now, the oil price cap was a good idea, but it was missing this point about the shadow fleet and the ability to move Russian oil outside of compliant systems. As far as we're aware, by the way, all of the shipping and all of the insurance services offered in Scandinavia are entirely compliant, and I don't think anybody is worried about that. There are some much more questionable players in the international market. I'd be happy to give you their home addresses and phone numbers if you want. I mean, it's not that secret. But I think you're playing chess against some people who are quite good at chess, or even very good at chess, and they're pretty cynical, tough characters. Is what I'm proposing like the ultimate magic bullet that immediately shuts down Russia? I don't know. Perhaps not. But if you just follow the logic of what was done by the G7 EU, was deny them access to the stock of dollars, attempt to restrict the flow of dollars, that's the oil price cap, it's not working because of the shadow fleet, going to the Greeks or the Hungarians, whatever, and saying we want additional sanctions on lifting of Russian oil may be difficult, but you don't have to because they're already sanctioned. These ships are already sanctioned. It's just that they're not OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the US Treasury is not sufficiently updated. They've not been sufficiently aggressive on this. The Europeans could absolutely play a role if they wanted. Sweden could publish the list itself. The Nordic countries could just say that these are the ships. Whether you could or would want to deny them access to the Danish Strait is a matter I discussed with the Prime Minister. He said the International Law of the Sea applies. Okay, well, it's still the case, according to the International Law of the Sea, as operating under agreed sanctions policy, that anyone who touches a sanctioned entity themselves becomes sanctioned, which is, by the way, not a policy that Europeans always love. I understand that. But I mean, look at the world we live in and think about what your alternatives are. So, and we can trace every single one of these transactions. And in fact, providing that information, publishing it, making it official, explaining it to people, that would be an immense service that's already done by various private agencies, but you could also play an official role in that, explaining to people, as Maria said, explaining what sanctions can do, what they can't do, what's missing. I think being honest with ourselves about this is essential, because if we're not, at the end of this experience, we're going to say, well, sanctions never work, which is not true. We didn't apply sanctions properly, fully, consistently. Sometimes it's very fashionable to say from time to time, and including this moment, the future of warfare has changed. The weapons of war are different. And people are talking about how drones are the new future of warfare, which might be true. I mean, on a tactical battlefield level, I think the future of warfare is very much like the past of warfare, which is all about economics. It's all about, can you earn, particularly when you're an importer of essential military components. Russia is not going to establish a viable microelectronics industry anytime soon, not unassisted. And the logical thing is to cut them off from their imports. And the way to cut them off, and you can't impose a sanction on China selling stuff to Russia. That's not going to work. We don't have visibility into that. But you can cut the Russians off from their flow of dollars dramatically. But even because it's chess, even showing that you're moving in the direction, even showing an understanding of that, even showing that you have a strategy that will lead to that. Ken Rogoff, my good friend, and another former chief economist of the IMF and a champion international chess player, likes to say that threats are much more powerful before they're exercised. So all you need to do is threaten to bring the shadow fleet, the sanctioned part of the shadow fleet, which is almost all of it, to apply those sanctions to anybody in India or China who buys oil that's passed through the sanction chain. That will get their attention, I promise you.
Can I actually challenge you a bit with China?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, because we always actually think in terms of we cannot do something about China because China is too big. But I mean, we are also big and important to China. So now when we're going to have with your president even harsher discussions around, customs on whatever things coming from China because of state interventions on the Chinese side, or all other discussions. Why don't we add a component in the China discussion that says that, you start with tariff level at 100, but if you indeed stop supplying Russia with all of their military component, it goes down to 70. So it becomes actually part of this discussion, and where China actually understands that this is really, really, really important to them. I mean, the Russian market is tiny compared to the US or Europe. So why don't we try to play that game?
So I like where you're going, Torbjörn. I think, and I'm not opposed to it. I think what you would find is a practical, and I'm all in favor of belt and suspenders and more suspenders, okay? But what I think you would find is that it's quite hard to monitor and enforce and observe. So the diversion of trade we have from, let's say, Italy to Kazakhstan or whatever, you'd see China selling to Kazakhstan, and then you have to trace it through these third-party countries and actually prove it came from China. It's hard. But to take the same thought and say, so why would China care about US sanctions at all? The teapot refiners is the term used for a lot of the people who buy Russian oil currently in China. Oh, sorry, buy Iranian oil. Why would teapot refiners care? Well, it turns out that in the whole supply chain, in the the unloading of the port, in the transportation, in any of the financial services, there are Chinese corporate entities and individuals who also do business with the West. And the way that US sanctions know, you know very well, so, but just make sure everyone's got there, is that there's bite on them when you touch the dollar transaction zone, right? So if you really were living entirely outside the dollar zone and never wanting to touch the dollar zone and never wanting to sell to Western companies or markets, you would ignore these sanctions completely. The reason that ships turn around when the US embassy calls the Chinese government and say, no, this one's egregious, you can't take this one, is because the Chinese don't want those sanctions to fall on Chinese companies, right? Because that's at least hugely inconvenient and maybe worse for them. So I think that I wouldn't say that China's vulnerable because of its exposure to Western markets. I would say they care about their exposure to sanctions and don't want to go there if they can avoid it. And remember, what we're really offering them is cheaper oil. That's actually the downside of my proposal, which is that, you know, Mr. Trump wants to punish China, and Russia is, in case it escaped anyone's notice, a client state of Russia. When Putin wanted to invade Ukraine, he went to see President Xi and said, I'm going in to only take a weekend. And Xi said, could you please wait till the end of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which he did. Assad was a client of Russia. Putin is a client of Xi. That's what you're looking at here. Trump is going to struggle to, his tariffs will have some effect on China. They're not going to have the effects that he claims and he wants and so on. The best way for him to confront China and Iran, which are in close alliance with Russia, is to stop Russia. Russia is the weak link in that alliance because Russia is so heavily committed in Ukraine, and Russia needs those imports as a pressing daily matter, basically, in order to fuel their missile and drone attacks. So let's do it all. But I think the shadow fleet piece is absolutely what's been missing so far. And it doesn't require an act of political will or all EU countries to agree or anything. We just have to follow the rules and agree to implement the rules. That's all.
Question update.
Thank you. Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm David Emstam. I'm head of the section in the Swedish Foreign Ministry dealing with Russia. So I'm responsible for Swedish new sanctions and proposals for new sanctions. Very interesting to listen to, Professor. I have a couple of questions. First, an argument that we hear quite often also in the public domain is that the whole design of the oil price cap is made such that because of the fact that there is a concern about the global oil price, and this is a way to mitigate it. I would like to hear your assessment. Is that a valid argument, and has the mitigation been successful or could it be more successful? The second question is whether also I would like to be interesting to hear your perspective on right now among us. With partners, we're very focused on listing ships, listing shadow fleet ships. That's what able.
How many ships are on your blacklist right now?
I think right now, well, on Monday, 70 or 80. As of now, I think 30, something like that. We adopted a new package.
No, but total, the new package had added 30. But if you take all the ships currently on the blacklist, how many ships is that?
Oh, we don't have an official blacklist, but you mean the ones that...
the ships that you've sanctioned.
Yes.
Add all those together. How many are on that list?
All, I mean, UK, it's UK, Sweden, UK, EU, and the US. We will probably not get half of the list yet. Then we could have, I haven't done a cross-check, but you have to look, is one ship listed by several actors or, yeah. Yes. So the second question was whether this listing or focus of ours, whether that's the effective tool, or if there are other tools that are more effective. Use the we have.
So I think the list is helpful and moving in the right direction. I think adding them in dribs and drabs is going to take a long time, right, to get to where I'm proposing. But I think what you haven't done, for whatever reason, is to link that list to the list of ships that are already sanctioned because of their transactions with Iran and Venezuela. So that's the key piece that's missing, I think, because then you don't have to make a new case to sanction them. They're already sanctioned, and then the question is who has touched them and who is transacting with them, and that is, you can publish that list and update that list on a daily or weekly basis. You know where to get the data from that. But on that, so I think that you're heading in the right direction, but I'm trying to encourage you to. I think you will get there. I think my job in a lot of these situations is to encourage people to get to where they want to go and where the logic takes them sooner rather than later. And even one day sooner would make a difference to some children in Ukraine who are probably being killed in the intervening period, right? What was the first question again?
Global oil price.
Yes. So look, the point, the concern, because Russia produces 8 million barrels of oil, more or less, a day in a world that consumes 100 million, was if you withdrew that oil. I mean, you could have shut down shipping through the Danish Strait. You could have put that sanction on. Could have put sanction on the Black Sea if you really wanted to. But there was concern that would reduce the supply of oil to the world market. So the idea of the price cap was encourage the oil to flow. And obviously, as you know, the price of oil goes up and down a lot over the cycle, and it's been low before. And the Russians are desperate for cash, so they will supply the oil even as low as $20 a barrel. But that would be a reduction in their surplus. I mean, you still buy LNG from Russia because switching to other sources of LNG is difficult, and I think what will happen, but hasn't happened yet. That's not a significant source of revenue for the Russians. The Russian economy, almost entirely for foreign currency to buy the weapons systems or components, it's almost entirely oil at this point, and it's mostly oil sold to India and China because Europe obviously switched to other suppliers. So I think that the design of the price cap was clever. The issue, it was evident at the beginning, was what level the price cap we set at. So it set at a fairly high level, and then there was this idea it would be negotiated down. Well, that's clearly not happened. But I think that and so this is part of the whole chess game point. What would be sufficient? You know, eventually you lower the cap. But I think just linking this already sanctioned ships with the shadow fleet and making it clear to anybody that the Indians will not buy from a sanctioned supply chain. No way, absolutely not. Not interested. They'll just walk away. The Chinese may require a bit more pressure. Mr. Trump wants to put pressure on China. This sort of thing he enjoys. Whether you link it to tariffs or not, a little bit more complicated and a bit more cumbersome, I would say. But sure, why not? Maybe given that he's going to put tariffs on for much less good reasons. So I think that thank you for your work, and please keep at it. But listen to these pleas, including from Ukraine, to accelerate. I don't think you'll shut down the Russian economy. I think the Russians have a resilience, which was mentioned earlier, that is real and historic and cultural, but they don't make all the components for their drones and missiles themselves, and the Chinese won't give it to them for free. And how else are the Russians going to pay for it? I think in the end, I mean, this is an uncomfortable thing to say, but I think I have to say it, which is that looking back, where we might say that the West, broadly defined, sold or gave Ukraine a lot of weapons to fight this war, but we also allowed Russia to earn the hard currency that it needs to fight the war. So the West is on both sides of this conflict. Now, I'm not, trying to blame anyone in particular. It's a difficult situation, and blowing up the market economies of the world is not a good idea. So I'm not encouraging a big oil price shock. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. Treasury understood this from the beginning, and the White House did not, honestly. And hopefully this will be broadcast live into Washington and so on, whatever. That's my assessment, and I think that's unfortunate, and I think it was a mistake, and I think the Biden administration did not push this through fully because they were afraid of what would happen to gas prices, and they thought they would lose the election. Well, they lost the election anyway, and Putin is still in Ukraine. So now we have a new administration with new priorities and a fear of China, and a deep dislike or concern about Iran. So I think you should tap into that conversation and understand their perspective and encourage them to apply the sanctions that are already in place.
Let's take one more question. Yeah, we have 5 minutes.
Hi, my name is Daniel Spiro. I'm an economist doing research also on sanctions, on the price cap, and I've read your work and I appreciate it. I agree very much with what you were saying, that we should uphold all the sanctions that we do have and so on. I guess I'm a little bit more skeptical towards those shadow fleet sanctions actually working that well for China and India. But
so you think the Indians and Chinese would actually transact with against sanctioned oil or sanctioned ships?
I'm not sure. So I mean, there's an issue of scale here also, that if you do it, like always when there's punishment, if you have to punish one guy, it's easy because then you just go after that guy and then you have an equilibrium. But when you have to start punishing a lot of people, a lot of firms, and then I think there's a difference. So I'm simply not sure whether this is going to work at scale or whether it's something that's going to work on like one ship or one firm level. But I wanted to ask something else that relates to the price cap and the level of the price cap. So, essentially the price cap, the way it works is like a buyer's cartel. Right. So there's a bunch of buyers. They're going to
OPEC.
Yeah, they're going to say, we're not going to buy oil for more than this price. And, from the beginning, it was pretty clear that actually China and India, they had a pretty strong self-interest in abiding by this price cap themselves. And I was hoping that they would. Now they didn't. And the question is whether it would be possible to somehow design the price cap, either to change its level to be even lower, or to do something else so that they will be on board, either formally or informally.
Yeah, so I wasn't in the room when it was negotiated, but I have talked to a lot of people who were involved, and I think the initial hope from the U.S. Treasury side was this would be an initial level. They wanted it lower. There was some compromises made, and that it would be lowered over time. There were proposals at the time that it should be, percent of Brent, for example, so it would go up and down. That was considered to be too complicated and too hard to communicate. But I think that I think it should be lower. That's the whole point of the cap. And I think the Russians would still pump their oil, and this is what we've been arguing. This continues to be our analytical assessment, because they're so desperate for cash, even at a much lower price cap. I mean, if you offer them zero, perhaps they will seal off all the wells, but sealing off these wells is an expensive and risky business, and you can't reopen them very, very easily. So, and the true marginal cost of production is almost certainly lower than $20 a barrel.
Mostly 10.
Yeah, 10 works for me, absolutely. So offer them 10.5 or 11 or whatever you think, $1 a barrel or something like that. They'll continue to pump. But we don't know, right? But unless you try it, you never find out. And I think there's a logical hole in our approach. I think the point about scale is very interesting. So you may be right that if we do it, I mean, but by the way, it's 900 ships. I can send you the names of the ships. And I can tell you their exact location in the world. And turning off your transponder in most maritime situations is a violation of the law of the sea, which the Prime Minister adheres to. There are some situations in which the US Navy or others may ask you to turn off your transponder. For example, if you're near the Houthi missile strikes, they don't want your transponder to be on. But in general, not having your transponder on is not acceptable. And if you turn off your transponder, we can find you by satellite imaging, and we can follow you around. This is not a lot of data for the guy. We just gave two Nobel Prizes this week for machine learning and AI in physics and chemistry. This is not a lot of data compared to what these guys can do, right? So now, could we? So I'm not sure there's a scale problem. But even if there is a scale problem, if I think there's a probability I'll be the one singled out, or that over time the singling out will increase from 1 to 5 to 20, that gets my attention already, right? And I think to Torbjörn's point, the Trump administration will be putting effort and resources into initiatives relative to China and Iran. I think they may put some effort into things that don't make a lot of sense and don't lead to sensible economic outcomes for themselves or others. I think encouraging them to head in this direction through whatever channels are available to all of us makes sense. And you know, I saw the timestamp there from Torbjörn, and I'm saying these things to you because I think you're a wonderful country and a wonderful people, and you just gave me a Nobel Prize, so that's nice. But I would say that what I plan to do is and I know the Nobel Foundation cares a lot about the use of its brand, and I signed lots of agreements, and I'm certainly not going to drag the name of Nobel into any of this. I just plan to go into any and every office around the world that I can, and all I'll do is put this on the table and say nothing more about it, and then we can talk about the details of Russian shipping and the shadow fleet and continuing the fantastic work that you guys have been doing. And believe me, I will say, and I've only ever said, I will only ever say great things about Sweden and about, you know, your approach to supporting Ukraine and to these issues. I think it's fantastic. I think I just wish more people understood the world like you understand the world, and I wish you all the best. And I really hope, and I really believe that we can get to better outcomes for Ukraine and for this entire region sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.